Welcome to the IGLYO Portraits of Queer Youth podcast series. Each podcast, we will speak to a different queer person from around the globe about their experiences and their local communities, bridging the gap between European queer activists and their colleagues around the world. This week, uniquely, we will be speaking to someone from one of our IGLYO network member organizations. Lilith is the Fundraising and International Relations Coordinator at Pink Life, an IGLYO member based in Turkey. Lilith, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for inviting. Actually, I really appreciate your effort and interest in us.
Of course, we're really excited to hear more about your experiences and especially that of Pink Life in Turkey. Before we start our conversation, it's really important we get a sense of who you are. So could you introduce yourself briefly before we get into it?
Of course, my name is Lilith, and I prefer they, them as my pronouns, but I am okay with she, her as well. Just avoid he, him. I am the fundraiser and international relations coordinator at Pink Life LGBTI Solidarity Association in Turkey. And in addition to my advocacy work in Pink Life, I am also a master's degree student at Boğaziçi University Linguistics department, and I usually focus on the relationship between language, gender, and sexuality in my studies.
I'm right in saying that Pink Life is the first organization dedicated to trans people in Turkey. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. And actually, it is still the first and the only trans self-led organization in Turkey.
As a trans woman, I'm delighted to speak to you. This is a real treat for me. So, Lilith, could you tell us what it means for you to exist in the world as a queer person? How has it changed your life and perspective moving through society as a queer person?
Of course, when it comes to society, society is aware of our identity even before we are aware of our own identity. So my queer identity, first of all, I faced discrimination. And due to this discrimination, actually, I started to move towards more safe spaces and ally spaces. And in the end, I moved towards solidarity among the queer community. And that's why me being as a queer person in Turkey, what it changed in my life is probably I am more resilient than any ordinary person in Turkey.
Could you speak more about that resilience? What does that bring to your life?
As a trans person, and maybe as a trans femme person, I should specify over here, because the level of discrimination and stigmatization is not the same for every identity. For example, trans women or trans femme people face more limitations when it comes to reaching or accessing some social services, education, health services, etc. And you want to live, you want to continue your life. And that's why you are looking for ways to survive within this system, this cis-centered system. That's why it improves trans people's resilience skills, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point. I think often people think of the trans community as this monolith and we're all the same, but the diversity of experiences based on identity is really significant, and it's always worth keeping in mind when thinking about the trans community and trans people in general. So thank you so much for that. Talking more about your local context and what it's like on the ground for trans people in Turkey, could you tell us what is that like? What is the local context for queer people, and what do you wish other people knew about your local community, about trans communities in Turkey and their experiences?
Although right now in the local context, we face many discrimination, especially with the conservative governments adopted this phobic political stance against LGBTI community. And following this, there has been some backlashes in terms of our rights. For example, we organized Pride March in Istanbul with a crowd of 10,000 people in 2010. But after that, the government started to ban the Pride events. And then following the ban, we observed many police brutality, which is really unfortunate. And what I want people to know, actually, usually the government uses this narrative. LGBTI community is not a part of our national value, and actually it is a strategic attack against Turkish nation from Western countries. So it is something borrowed. So this is their claim actually. But as a person who is studying Lubunja, which is queer slangs that is spoken by trans sex workers and more recently among LGBTI activists, I observed that actually queer community, especially trans femme community, had existed even during Ottoman era. And I found an evidence of Lubunja, the language of trans femme. It is not appropriate to say call them trans, maybe, because this terminology was not used during that time. They were calling themselves Lubunya. But I can say that they are mostly trans feminine, doing sex work or dancers. So it was part of our national value and tradition. And it is not something that is adopted from Europe. It is not something new. And queer community, LGBTI people have existed through all history, and we are still here.
Of course. And I think that's really interesting. And thank you for letting us know about that. I think so often, especially attacks against trans people, are that this is some sort of new faddish thing that's happening. And it's always really important to know our history. And yeah, as you say, these people wouldn't have described themselves as trans, but I think there's definitely always, where you have these communities in history, you can very much see a trans experience being lived, even if that's not the word that was used. So this was during the Ottoman period in Turkish history?
Yes, the news item that I found is dating to 1904. So it was during the late Ottoman era.
Definitely something then for, I think, listeners to go and research more about themselves after they listen, because it is really important we know our own history. It's so much of the narrative against us is that we're new and we're faddish and we've come from nowhere, but we've been here for centuries and millennia. Given all that adversity, given all those attacks that you're under from the government, what passion drives you to do this work? What passion really drives you in life? What really keeps you doing this essential work you do?
My passion is actually just existing as a trans person and making sure that our existence as trans people are not deleted or erased from history and will not be erased from history. So that's why I am still continuing my master's degree at Boğaziçi University on linguistics, and my passion is actually transforming academic field and academia in general with trans perspective, because I think, especially in Turkey, academia is so cis-centered, and as a trans person who is focusing on trans community and telling our own story through our perspective is really significant. That's why my passion is transing the academia, actually, because I am not trying to just pass in quote unquote pass in academia. I am not trying to adopt their own style, etc. Of course, I am conducting my research professionally, But when it comes to presenting it, I am just adding some trans soul through some image, some color, and making sure that trans visibility is unavoidable.
Obviously, IGLYO is a queer youth organization, and we're very interested in building up the next generation of activists. A huge problem, obviously, that I'm sure in a context like Turkey you've experienced is people coming into activism very, very excited and then burning themselves out very quickly and leaving the activist scene again. So if you were speaking to a room of queer youth, what wisdom would you pass on to them? What do you wish they knew about activism, and what do you wish they were aware of at the early parts of their career, their journey, however you want to phrase it?
We will come to this life only once. Yeah, maybe I don't know, but I believe in this. I don't know. So make sure that you are having fun. That's why I regret the raves that I didn't attend, and because I miss my days, my raving days for 3 days without sleep, etc. Right now, I cannot do that, and these days will pass. So go out on Friday night, have fun.
I think that's a really important message. I think so often we can be weighed down by the heaviness of life and the heaviness that comes with the discrimination that we sometimes face and the oppression that queer communities face, especially trans people and trans femmes particularly. And I think it's
Yeah.
really important. I think I wholeheartedly agree. I hope the next generation knows to have fun while doing it. Make the change, make the difference, change the world. But God, have some fun. Before you know it, you'll be 30, and that's an experience that I didn't think I'd have. So have the fun
Yeah,
while you can.
In Turkey, there is an amazing queer party scene actually, and I am really happy about that. Yeah, I can say that we can compete with Berlin.
Yeah. And I think that's really important. I think when I was a young person, I was kind of dismissive of queer nightlife because there was so much work to be done, and I was a trans woman, and things seemed so tough. I was like, oh, why do we focus all our energy on these bars and these drag shows? We need to be doing more. And I think the older I've gotten, the more I see them as really essential self-care and caring spaces. They're really, really important, that nightlife scene. So I'm glad that you have a vibrant one in Turkey. That is us coming to the end of our interview. But before you leave us, I have one last question. Who is Lilith? How do you want people to see you after this interview? How do you hope people remember you? What do you hope that you've gotten across during the course of this interview?
This is a hard question, the hardest one probably,
We're
because I am
sneaky.
still trying to discover who is Lilith. I think there is no one stable answer because I am changing, evolving, and improving, hopefully. And but I can say that I am a proud trans feminine living in Turkey, and uh, I am a nerd. I really I really enjoy studying lessons, reading really well thought articles.
Well, thank you for that last word, Lilith. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. And thank you to all our listeners. This has been Portraits of Queer Youth from IGLYO. Till next time, bye.